Hmm.
Okay, we are live.
All right, we have 8 so far here on Zoom. Give it one more minute. Hmm. All right, we got another. Oh, okay, I think we should start. All right, hello everybody and welcome. I'm Mike Folkman. I'm the chair of the Disability Caucus of the Albany County Democratic Committee, and I'm joined by 7 other people here, including our guest speaker. Um, some of you, okay, some of you may not have heard of the Albany County Disability Caucus yet. We just started about 6 months ago. While many other constituency segments within political parties have their own caucuses, we decided it's about time we had our own as people with disabilities because, you know, back about 20, 25 years ago, one of our super advocates down in Washington, who is considered the father of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Justin Dart Jr., said and encouraged us to all get into politics because, as if, get into politics as if our lives depend on it, because it does. And if many of you are familiar with our usual processes, we rely on elected officials to do the things we need them to do for us. And a lot of times they say they're going to do it, but then end up not doing it. So instead of just asking other people to do it, we should get involved and be part of the process and actually get on committees and get ourselves out there ready for public positions. Uh, so it's important that we do this, get more people to vote at the very least. So we have our first town hall meeting with a candidate running for office. It's Phil Steck, who is an assembly member from the 110th district in the town of Colony. Well, a couple of things I want to say first. We do want to have this broadcast accessible to everyone. Uh, we have not raised any funds, and we can't afford captioning right now, but we are recording this, and we will post this in various places like YouTube and Google Chat, and we will have the recordings captioned. So eventually we'll be able to do this with every other broadcast we do, and hopefully there will be many in the future. In fact, we have 3 scheduled for next week. Watch out for the time and the place of the broadcast, which is going to be same place right here. There is an election coming up, a primary election on June 23rd. That's less than from 2 weeks from now. The Board of Elections is going to distribute accessible absentee ballots. If you want to vote absentee. They're available from the Board of Elections. A voter who is unable to mark a paper ballot because of a disability can request an accessible absentee ballot using the request form found at a link we will post on Facebook and everywhere else. You may need to download this form to your device and open in Adobe so you can complete and send by mail. The voter must email their completed request form to their county Board of Elections on or before June 16th. Voters can sign the request form with text input and e-signature. The county Board of Elections will email the accessible absentee ballot to the voter as soon as possible after it receives the voter's request form. The county Board of Elections also mails a postage paid return envelope and oath envelope to the voter. On the electronic ballot, the voter can mark their selections on the computer and print it out at home so that you have a copy for your records. The voter must sign the oath envelope anywhere on the envelope, then put the ballot in the oath envelope. The voter must put the oath envelope in the larger envelope provided with paid postage by the county board of elections. A voter must get to the must, a voter must get the ballot in the mail by June 22nd or hand deliver it to the county board of elections by June 23rd. If you have any questions about New York's new accessible absentee ballot process, contact Disability Rights New York's voting hotline at 800-993-8982, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 p.m. So, without further ado, let's get this town hall started. Here is Phil Steck from the town of Colony, and he will receive questions from our moderator, Melanie Hecker, who will ask these questions that have been prepared in advance. And Shamika Andrews is also standing by to assist her with any questions that are submitted through Facebook and any other way that they can be sent. They will be added to this program. So, Melanie, you can have it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melanie Hecker. I am a master's in public administration student at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at the University at Albany. So I'm an autistic self-advocate, and I wear a lot of hats in the Albany disability community. But among the more notable ones, I was previously the systems advocate at Youth Power at Families Together in New York State, and have also interned for Independent Living Center of the Hudson Valley and Disability Rights New York. And so I'll be moderating tonight with these predetermined questions, and we're going to kick things off with the topic of community integration. The vast majority of Americans with disabilities and older Americans prefer home and community-based services that allow them to live independently in their communities. However, state and insurance providers of long-term supports and services, abbreviated LTSS, still restrict access to community-based services. Without these services, people with disabilities may end up in institutions that deprive them of their fundamental freedoms and cut their lives short. This reliance on institutional placement is also far more expensive than prioritizing services in the community. We are experiencing a critical shortage of community attendants to provide services to seniors and people with disabilities who are living in their homes. So my first question to you, Assemblymember Steck, is what steps would you take to alleviate such a crisis?
I think that the first thing I have to talk about, again, is that any politician can come on here and tell you everything you want to hear. That's not being honest. So the first fundamental problem that you have is a lot of these things require funding. The Consumer-Directed Personal Assistance Program, which is one of the programs that enables people to live independently, requires funding. And right now, the governor is looking to cut all the programs that help people with disabilities to live independently. And that is because of the COVID budget crisis. However, it need not be that way. The essential problem here is that to do these things, we can raise the revenue, but the governor doesn't support revenue raising measures. So for example, I am the sponsor of the bill to reintroduce the stock transfer tax. It's 1% transfer tax that New York imposed on sales of stock from 1905 to 1980. And that would raise about $13 billion annually. So it would certainly enable us to stop the budget cuts. It would enable us to put more money into some of the infrastructure that we need to do. As chair of the task force, for example, housing for persons with disabilities was reached a high, if I recall correctly, of $5 million, and it's now down to $1 million. So I think also it's not just about saying what we want to fund, it's also about process. And in New York State, as I was explaining before we started the official part of the call, unlike the United States government where Congress controls the budget, the Assembly and Senate do not control the budget in New York. In 1927, our Constitution was amended so that we have a governor-dominated budget process in which the legislature cannot add to this spending in the budget, can only subtract or delete. So while there are some nuances on that, that's still fundamentally the case. So in order to increase the funding for programs which allow people to live at home, such as the independent living centers, which we had in the last two budgets secured increases for, in the task force on people with disabilities, we need to be talking about raising revenue.
Thank you very much. So I think you've touched on this a little bit in your discussion, but the next point that I'd like to ask about is, what do you think Albany County should do to assist families and caregivers of people with disabilities?
Well, I'm not an Albany County legislator anymore, so I don't have any direct influence on Albany County government, but I was a county legislator for 12 years. And when I was there, we had a physician who was on the county legislature, Pat Timmons from Colony, and he was very instrumental in increasing funding that would allow more people to get services at home so they could avoid going into nursing homes, right? And the point you made is it's much less expensive to do that. So I think that, again, it all comes down to revenue, and I think it's difficult for municipalities and local government to do that because they don't have the revenue raising capability that the state does. So we, for example, Albany County can't put in place a stock transfer tax, whereas the state can. Albany County cannot put in a income tax increase for billionaires. The state can. So I think this is more about the state expanding funding for existing programs that allow people to stay in their own home. Another really important factor is I'm a co-sponsor of the New York Health Act. I am a 100% unabashed advocate for the single payer health insurance system. And I think that would help as well, because everyone would have health insurance for their medical needs. I think a lot of the money that the county spends now on Medicaid would be taken care of through the single payer health insurance program. And that would go a long way to make it easier for us to assist families and caregivers of people with disabilities.
Yes, it would. Indeed, it would. It's always follow the money.
Yes, unfortunately, that is the case. And, you know, the money that the governor gets to run for office does not come from people with disabilities.
Can I jump in, Melanie, and ask a follow-up question?
Sure thing.
Yeah.
So thank you. So with the pandemic, and there's obviously been an increase in institutionalization after people leave the hospital. We're seeing so many people go into nursing facilities. How can we ensure that, well, as an assembly member, what would you do to advocate to make sure that we have, communities have the resources they need to make sure that people have homes to go back to, that there are services and supports in the community so that people can return to more cost-effective and higher quality of living in their communities?
Well, I think that's basically what we try to do with the consumer-directed personal assistance program, and also with the independent living centers. With respect to COVID, the Assembly did pass legislation requiring all the nursing homes to have a plan for dealing with these type of crises. But the governor also issued an executive order exempting nursing homes from liability in connection with, harm done to their patients who developed the virus. And the other bill that was on was to study why we had such a failure with nursing homes during COVID. I was the only Democrat to vote for that bill. That was a Republican amendment. And I felt that even though I supported the Democratic bill, which had to do with the impact of COVID on minority communities, I felt that the impact on people in nursing homes, many of whom are people with disabilities, should also have been studied. And I was the only Democrat to vote for that. So again, I think if you come back to it, it's not just about having programs. The New York State budget is a long series of partially funded programs because there's an unwillingness by the governor to raise revenue. And I think when you evaluate politics generally, you have to be very careful that that there's a huge difference between public relations and reality. And the governor is a master of public relations. He's not a master of policy. And I think that's a problem. One of my favorite examples, this is just funny, it has nothing to do with people with disabilities per se, but it gives you an indication of you got to be careful. So I had some advocates who came to visit me. They were supporters of vaping. I'm very opposed to vaping, but they were telling me that a certain member told them that that member was fighting to support their position on the issues affecting vaping. I know for a fact that that particular member never said a word in the Democratic conference or otherwise in support of their position, but they thought he was their best friend. So, you have to be careful of that, but I do think that we have a lot of great programs in New York. A lot of them, the real issue is to make sure that they have adequate funding. Another thing that happens, you got to be careful too. When the governor announces a new program, a lot of times that's for public relations purposes and there's no increase in the budget. So what he's doing is he's taking money from other parts of the budget to fund his new program, which is also partially funded. So for example, when he wanted to fund, the so-called free college, which isn't really free college, it's a additional scholarship money, but he called it free college. So there was money taken from all parts of the budget to fund that, and I dare say some of it was taken from funding for programs that benefit people with disabilities, like housing for people with disabilities. That has declined from $5 million to $1 million, and we try every year to get more money back into it unsuccessfully.
Thank you very much. This is a difficult topic, considering that COVID has been throwing a monkey wrench into everything lately. So our next question is, disabled people frequently must live in institutional settings because of the lack of accessible housing, the institutional bias of Medicaid, and the attendant worker shortage. At the same time, nursing facilities have been granted immunity by New York from claims of negligence in preparing for and responding to COVID-19. Do you support nursing facility immunity from liability, and why?
I don't. I don't. That's something the governor did. And by the way, I voted against giving the governor dictatorial powers during the COVID crisis. I also voted against giving the governor power to cut the budget in light of the COVID crisis. So I'm not on board with allowing the governor by executive order to do things like grant immunity to anyone, quite frankly.
True, true. So with that, we're going to move on to our next topic area. With the tragic death of George Floyd, an issue that many communities have been thinking about a lot lately is the area of criminal justice. People with disabilities are more likely than non-disabled people to be the victims of crime. From 2011 to 2015, the rate of violent victimization against people with disabilities was at least 2.5 times the rate for those without disabilities, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities experience sexual assault at much higher rates than the rest of the population, and are often targeted specifically because of their disabilities. What steps will you take to address the sexual assault of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities?
Well, first of all, the independent living centers do offer community training specific to these issues. So obviously we have to, continue to support the independent living centers. Last budget, we did get them an increase. It wasn't a tremendous increase, but it was an increase nonetheless. One of the difficulties that we face in government is that government is continually trying to lower taxes and lower the quality of care, less people available. So one of the key issues is to have quality, well-paid staff. We pay people so poorly that do this kind of work that it's very difficult to make sure that you're getting, the type of staff that you would want to entrust your loved ones to. So I think that with respect also to law enforcement, in addition to what the independent living centers do, I think it might be time to make sure that our police force has people with appropriate backgrounds, such as social workers, that can help them interact with various communities that have disproportionately suffered from crime. And I think that would be a step forward to addressing this issue. It might make the police more sensitive to it. So I think, again, I think the independent living centers do train people. They do train people with disabilities. They do train law enforcement. We need better people working in the field who provide care, higher wages for those people. And the police should be required to have appropriate personnel on staff. You know, it's not just about punishment and arresting people. It's about making sure people in the community are being properly cared for.
Thank you so much. And so, building on that answer,
Mm-hmm.
how will you ensure that state law enforcement is trained to appropriately interact with disabled citizens, including people who may be nonverbal, who use a communication device, or who are deaf, to prevent unnecessary incarcerations and injuries?
Well, I think, you know, the state police the state police academy is a much more extensive training than, say, local police get. You can actually, local police training is pretty short. So I think it's a question of two things: making sure the training is there, but also I think you got to have people on staff who don't need to be police officers, who are expert in these areas and can provide guidance in these situations. I think that's how this should be handled.
So, what sorts of non-police officer employees do you have in mind?
It could be social workers, would be typically people who might be able to fulfill this function.
Great, thank you. The New York State Legislature recently passed the STAT Act, which seeks to collect demographic data on people who die in so-called arrest-related deaths. The data collected includes age, race, and sex, but not disability. Would you support expanding the law to require police departments to collect data on the number of disabled people who die arrest-related deaths?
I think that the STAT Act, what the STAT Act does is for every traffic ticket up to the highest arrest, that there, in addition to the normal pedigree that the officer takes from the victim, the STAT Act requires that race be listed. So that a person's race be one of the things that's in that form. And I was talking with the chief of police of the town of Colony today. He did not have any objection to that because of the fact that with all the information that they collect at arrest anyway, it's just particularly now that there's computers, that the more, it's quite easy for the police to do that. Here's the police reform bills of today. So, you know, one of the things with the STAT Act, like any issue affecting people with disabilities, is that in the task force, we don't really want to do anything unless there's a consensus in the community that they would want to have this done. The minority caucus in the legislature, which is, you know, one of the most, is probably the most influential group in the entire assembly, they had a consensus that they wanted the STAT Act passed. I'm not sure that in the disabilities community there would be such a consensus, but if you could get such a consensus, I think it would be quite easily added to the STAT Act.
Thank you very much. So, We've been talking a lot about resources tonight, and this is another resources-based question. How would you direct resources to support people with disabilities and deaf people who experience sexual and/or domestic violence?
I mean, again, we have a lot of programs that deal with these things, but they're all partially funded. So I think that we have to, I mean, the main thing we have to do is reinstate the stock transfer tax. And a lot of the revenue that is currently being used for other purposes that might be funded by, say, the stock transfer tax could be shifted to some of these human needs. But again, under the current New York State budget system, especially in light of the COVID, where you got a decline in sales tax, a decline in income tax, a massive drain on state revenue to pay for unemployment benefits, all these things, unless you're willing to raise revenue, it's kind of pointless to talk about which programs you're going to fund, because a lot of the programs that already exist, for example, are going to be reduced unless we take appropriate measures to raise revenue. So that's where we are right now.
Thank you. Our next question: what steps would you take to address the overwhelming school to prison pipeline for students with disabilities?
Well, I think it's a question of two things. One is the supporting the education of persons with disabilities, and also supporting the employment of people with disabilities. Now, my field, actually, in addition to being a member of the Assembly, I'm an attorney, and my practice area is civil rights and employment law, and we represent employees. I do a lot of ADA cases. We have several in the office right now. One of my partners who works with me in that area also does the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which has really revolutionized education for persons with disabilities. A lot of the schools still are resistant to this. I think I know why they are. We had this experience one year where the State School Boards Association was basically telling school districts that they did not have to abide by a certain federal decision under the IDEA, which was completely incorrect, because the local school districts are under tremendous pressure from a budgetary standpoint because they're funded through property tax. So if we want to increase funding for the education of people with disabilities, I think we got to start looking at alternatives to funding education through property taxes, because those are harder for people to pay. And New York State has something called foundation aid, which is designed to give poorer districts more funding from state revenue. That program was basically put on hold because of COVID. So again, I think the basics of it are in place in terms of the IDEA and the ADA, but I hate to keep coming back to the funding part of it. It's very difficult to do this funding at the level that's appropriate, not just have partial funded programs that are for show when you're unwilling to raise revenue. That's the basic issue. The Governor Cuomo came of age politically around 1980. He was in the Clinton administration. You know, these are Democrats, but their philosophy was, we have to be more like Ronald Reagan if we're going to win any elections. So we got to, cut taxes on the wealthy. We need campaign contributions from the wealthy in order to compete with Republicans. I think that's, if it ever was true, it's certainly not true now. because we've had tremendous accumulation of wealth at the top that has not been appropriately taxed. I was a delegate for Bernie Sanders at the 2016 Democratic Convention. You know, I was running as a delegate for Bernie again. So, I mean, my philosophy on these matters is that we have to have a more equal distribution of wealth in the United States in order to enable people to, provide for themselves and their families, and also to fund the programs that support people with disabilities. I don't think we can get there just by talking about government programs. We have to have government programs that have real funding.
Thank you, Assemblymember. And
Can I jump in, Melanie?
yes, sir.
Thank you. So regarding funding, and I guess in the current climate, if it's not going to be possible to raise taxes on the super rich, do you think there might be a way to create public-private partnerships, kind of like here in the city of Albany, where Albany Medical Center, they pay a pilot payment in lieu of taxes. So kind of like that social investment from private partners. Do you think that would be a possible way that revenues could be raised in lieu of taxes?
No, I think that's very good public relations, and it will help some people, but it is not an effective method for dealing with these issues. First of all, when you have payment in lieu of taxes, what that means is someone's not being taxed at the full rate that they should be taxed at. Now, we are the state that gives the most tax credits and tax deductions to corporations of any state in the nation ×4. So, we've got a $400 million. I can solve all your disability funding problems with one solution. Eliminate the tax credit for movie making in the state of New York. $400 million. We have tax credits for yacht building, because yacht building, creates jobs on Long Island. So we have a tax credit for that. These tax credits have gotten out of control. Remember that every time you have a tax credit, that's really, it is a loss of revenue that you would otherwise get. Now, arguably, some economic activity is increased by these things, but all the studies show that it's not an appreciable increase, and it's far outweighed by the revenue that you're losing. So let's say we did away with, let's say I were governor, and by the way, you give me 30 million and I'm ready to run tomorrow. And we did away with the movie making tax credit and fully funded all our programs for people with disabilities. We'd have money left over, quite frankly, because when I talk about a housing budget of $1 million for people with disabilities, and you're looking at a $400 million tax credit program, which basically benefits the very wealthy, I think it shows that our priorities are cockeyed. So no, I think I'll be frank with you. I am a New Dealer. I believe in direct government expenditure in the economy. I am not of the Bill Clinton era with the public-private partnerships. I don't think they're effective. I think Roosevelt was far more right for helping Americans live better lives than the likes of Bill Clinton. So that's just where I'm coming from.
Thank you.
And if we could get rid of all of these tax credit programs that only benefit the wealthy,
yes,
would you support diversion programs to move people with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges from the criminal justice system into treatment and support services in the community?
Yes.
Okay, yes.
Again, we've got this problem that the New York State budget is a giant shell game, that they move stuff from one area to another for public relations purposes of the governor. You know, we need to make a real commitment. There are programs that exist in jails already that are moving in that direction. They should be moved out of the jails. But again, without a serious commitment to raising revenue, these are just goals to talk about and not actuality. And I want to make them actuality. You know, I just want to throw something else out there for people to consider. So this is actually quite important, and sometimes we forget this. And that is, we have an obligation in the state to fund roads, bridges, water, sewer systems, and all that. We can't avoid it, right? And what has this got to do with persons with disabilities? It has a lot to do with it for the following reason. When you're spending 60% of your federal discretionary budget on military and war, what happens is all the aid that the federal government used to give to the states for those roads and bridges and other things, water, sewer, dries up. And then what happens is that the state has to fund those things on its own, which means that the state doesn't have the funds that it needs to support some of the programs that you're talking about. So everything is connected. You can't go out there and say, I'm for war, you know, all over the world and expect there to be funding for persons with disabilities. It's not going to happen.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember. So, do you know how many people in your jail have a mental health issue, an addiction, a serious mental illness?
So I don't run a jail. I mean, the Albany County Jail, we don't, the State Department of Corrections has a portion of it that supervises local jails. I'm not on the corrections committee, which deals with that issue on the state level. So that is not information that I have.
Understood.
I know that it's substantial from practical experience, and my hat's off to Sheriff Apple for some of the things he's done. I mean, the sheriff and I have other substantial disagreements. I was advocating against militarization of the police 4 years ago, and he called me on the phone and chewed me out. But I disagree with militarization of the police. That's something you do in when you want to abolish democracy in some, third world country. That's not something that should exist here. So, but he's doing a very good job in trying to address problems that people have with substance abuse at the jail. Another thing on that issue is one of the things that we do want to do that when we talk about this in the context of DWI, what DWI laws do is when someone comes before the court and with a DWI conviction or several convictions, the court will order the person to go to treatment, right? And we have not done the same thing with drugs. So one of the problems that you have with treatment, and this is true with alcohol, is the same as it is with heroin, is that in order to get people to be successful in treatment, they have to be accepting of treatment. And that doesn't always happen the first time. The first time someone who's a alcoholism offender comes before the court, they may not go into treatment, or they may be ordered to treatment and refuse. And there are penalties for that. And eventually, though, the hope is that they will eventually be successful in treatment if they're forced into it gradually. I had a very interesting experience with this when I was a young lawyer. I was representing a woman in a sex discrimination case. She ran a life insurance agency. And we were settling the case, and she came to me and she says, I want you to get me lifetime health insurance. She's like 41 or 42 years old. I said, we really can't do that because to really get health insurance legitimately through the company, you have to be on the payroll. I can get you money that you can use for health insurance, but I can't get you lifetime health insurance. And I was young, just starting out in that field. And I said to her, well, why is that so important to you at age 42? She said, hepatitis C. I said, hepatitis C? How did you get that? She said, intravenous drug user. Now, what that taught me was that obviously in her youth, she had gotten involved in that, but it taught me that people can be rehabilitated. And she went on to be very successful. And people, throughout history have been able to put those problems behind them. But I think government has to assist in doing that. And I was sponsor, for example, of legislation which we passed to require insurance companies to make certain drugs available to stabilize drug addicts while they're in the hospital, so they could be, if they're stable, you have a chance to have the social workers try and convince them to get into treatment. So this is it's not only a question of law enforcement, because a lot of time law enforcement is taking these, or fire departments are taking overdose people to hospitals, but we have to have hospitals that are properly staffed to try and encourage treatment, and a legal system that functions the same way as a DWI, where they try and get people into treatment as well. So there's a lot involved in that.
Thank you very much. So continuing on with this theme, what do you think is the most effective way to stabilize people committing nuisance crimes and prevent them from re-entering the criminal justice system?
So the Assembly recently passed legislation, of which I was a co-sponsor, that ensures those who are charged with nuisance violations, a violation is not a crime, by the way, are issued an appearance ticket and not arrested and unnecessarily and injuriously jailed. So I think that's a big step forward. I do think that we need, for people who have drug problems that lead them to commit nuisance violations, I think we need a system whereby courts can intervene to try and have a civil order where they can be sent to treatment. Again, it's like DWI. People may not succeed on the first choice, and no one is suggesting that they should go to jail if they're unsuccessful. This is a civil matter. But at least we need to try. And one of the objections to that bill is there's not enough funding. Well, I think if anything I've established in this phone call, it is that I believe very strongly that we have to raise revenue so that we can have not just partial funding for a lot of these good programs where people are waiting online for services, but actual, programs that are funded to the extent necessary to do the job.
Thank you, Assemblymember. So on to our next question. As we've been discussing in this town hall, majorities of voters now support treatment for people with substance use and mental health issues over incarceration. Given this shift and innovative new approaches to health and substance use treatment, what have you implemented here?
So for mental health, we did pass Kendra's law. Kendra's law is a law that was passed before I got in the Assembly, but we renew it from time to time. And it enables families to petition a court to get mental health treatment for one of their family members. I introduced legislation to do the same for people who are suffering from addictions. I did have a constituent whose daughter was a heroin addict, and she came into my office and called this issue to my attention. But we have been unable to get that bill passed. I think one of the difficulties is that in the minority community, this is a very interesting question. Most of the substance abuse treatment counselors are not from the minority community. And that community is very resentful of trying to be, directed to do anything, through the legal system, because the legal system has so repeatedly failed them. And so but we do have that bill, and it's something that we had, bills go in cycles. Sometimes, for example, when I first introduced the stock transfer tax, that bill was not something that we were working on every day. But because of the financial crisis in the state in light of COVID, we work on trying to get that bill passed every day. I've been on national news about it. I was on Ralph Nader's radio show about it. We have 100 not-for-profit organizations supporting the bill. We have a letter from economists supporting the bill. So my point is that, we did try to pass the substance abuse equivalent of Kendra's law, which is for mental health issues, but we ran into objections, and we didn't think that we could be successful in that, but maybe sometime in the future we'll give it another try.
Would you be supportive of an expansion of law enforcement assisted diversion? What's currently being implemented to some extent here in Albany across the state?
So I'm not really sure exactly what is being done in Albany. I'd really have to look at what's being done in Albany. A lot of times with these things, I'm skeptical of them because it's good public relations for politicians, but I don't know what the scope of the program is, how effective it is, who's administering it. Those are questions. If there was legislation to propose it on the state level, we'd certainly love to take a look at it. One of the things about being in the assembly is you'd be surprised at how much legislation comes up from the grassroots level. So I mentioned my effort on and how I got involved in, some of the bills on drug addiction. It was because of this one constituent, and I did get a bill passed to help stabilize people in hospitals so they could get treatment. And I was actually the introducer of that bill, and I was the lead debater for the Assembly majority on that bill. That was the bill also that limited the number of opioids that doctors could prescribe to a certain specific time period so that we could keep people away from opioid addiction through medical treatment. But my point is that when we're trying to design a program like that, and we're talking about how do we fund it, I can't really comment on something that has not been brought to my attention.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of the Albany County program. Remember, I'm a state level guy. And if I were in the county legislature still, I'm probably aware of it, but I'm not.
Yeah, lead it law enforcement assisted diversion. It's a program within the city of Albany. Gives the police officers discretion on whether or not they want to arrest somebody accused of a low level offense or put them into diversion. It has to, the defendant has to consent to it. In theory, it's a great idea, but it would obviously, it's not implemented, across the board. So there would have to be more education around it.
Yeah, I think that if
that
you're
kind
thinking
of
about
thing.
doing it as a state program, when you're trying to draft legislation, you'd probably have to specify the specific types of offenses or the types of offenders who would be eligible. It would be more complicated. I have to tell you one thing, that while I'm totally supportive of community-based diversion, one of the things I'm not a big fan of, because I've been practicing law for 35 years, is so-called judicial discretion. I want clear rules, right? So I'm representing a client. I know they're eligible. Let's do it. When you deal with judicial discretion, a lot of times the judges can take umbrage at the way a client looks, acts in the courtroom, which might not reflect the reality of that defendant. So I think it's a great idea for a statewide program, but again, we'd have to talk about, what are the specific criteria for that? And, in the assembly, we can't be all things to all people. I'd be happy to work on that bill if someone wanted to bring it to our office, no problem. But we tend to take up bills that are in our own area of expertise or that constituents bring to us. I do a lot of bills on employment law. I do a lot of bills. I have a bill, for example, to amend the state human rights law to make, in the human rights law, if you win a case of disability discrimination, you don't recover attorney's fees. Only victims of sex discrimination recover attorney's fees. That makes no sense to me. Another thing is, under federal law, if you've been injured, say in an auto accident, you have a disability resulting from that accident, you can get a leave of absence from your employment to give you time to recover from that disability so that you can work again. New York courts never recognized that principle because, believe it or not, the New York human rights law existed before the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it didn't have a concept of reasonable accommodation, believe it or not. If you were unable to go to work, you weren't covered under the New York law, which makes no sense. So a lot of the courts ruled that, no, if you can't go to work, you're not covered under the law. And we actually had a case where a woman that I represented was taken to the hospital in a stretcher, bleeding with an ectopic pregnancy. And she couldn't go back to work for several months. The State Division of Human Rights said that she had no case, and we had to go to federal court, and we were successful. But my point is that I tend to do a lot of those type of things. I do stuff with the task force on people with disabilities. We're very active in the revenue raising area. That's just something I've always had an interest in, economics, so we work on that. And we're certainly willing, if someone wants to bring us a statewide bill for law enforcement assisted diversion, my legislative director and I would be happy to work on that, but no one has brought it to our attention yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember. And with that, we are going to move on to our next topic area. We're going to be talking about preparing the future of the disability community with the topic of education. Due to the enactment and implementation of a key civil rights law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, high school graduation rates for people with disabilities has increased 45% since 1995, an associated degree decrease in dropout rates. Similarly, enrollment in college has doubled for students with disabilities. Nevertheless, local school districts struggle to serve students with disabilities, and those seeking higher education continue to face enormous barriers to success. What steps will you take to ensure that the education system meets the needs of all children, including those with disabilities?
So I think the IDEA has had a lot of the positive effects that you pointed out. I think there's a lot of resistance among school districts to providing a lot of these services because there are certain people that are very difficult or indeed impossible to educate. And it's very costly for a school district to provide those services. So some of these things are not really best handled by a school district. I will give you an example. I represented a client who was a teacher's aide, and his sole function, all he did all day was feed, clothe, toilet a person who was wheelchair bound and did not have any realistic capability of being educated, right? There are people in that condition. So the school districts, unfortunately, having an influx of a number of children in a year who they have to provide services to can really be a budget buster for them. So I think the question is, it's very difficult to fund these things on a local level, that there has to be more state aid available so that the requirements of the IDEA can be met. Our law firm does a lot of cases in IDEA. We have a number now with autism. We're very familiar with the fact that that you can have a lot more effectiveness in helping educate a student with autism if you start when they're very young. When districts refuse to do that, they can damage that student forever. And so, certainly something that I'm aware of. The federal law has made a huge difference. But one of the things that I wanted to mention, and I mentioned this earlier, it has to do with the positions that school districts take because they still resist this. So there was a decision that came down from the federal court, the Second Circuit, which is the highest federal court in New York State, that said that when a student with disabilities was not able to get services from the school district, that the school district had to pay if a state administrative law judge or hearing law officer ruled that those services had to be provided, that those services, that the school district had to pay for those services pending the final outcome of the case, okay? And the School Boards Association of the state of New York told the districts that they didn't have to do it. I don't know what they were thinking. And one of the differences here, that's very interesting, between upstate and downstate. In New York City, you have all these not-for-profit groups that take on litigation and force schools to follow IDEA. We don't have stuff like that in upstate New York. We really don't. There's very little of that, and not too many private attorneys who do it. I happen to have a partner who does. So I think a lot of this has to do with two things. One is enforcement of the law, so that the school districts realize that paying judgment to people who win these cases is a lot more costly than just providing the services in the first instance. And two, I don't think they're capable of doing it on their own without state funding. And three, I think there are some students who might better off be handled not by the local school district, because the local school district doesn't have the resources for that type of student. So that's 3 points on that.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember. And so now I'd like to turn our attention to an issue that my fellow students and I were rallying for back in February at our Higher Education Disability Advocacy Day rally. In the past couple of decades, enrollment of students with disabilities in our colleges and universities has increased exponentially. Despite this large increase in enrollment, there has been little to no corresponding increase in funding for disability service centers at our colleges and universities. To correct this inequity, post-secondary students with disabilities are advocating for a $15 million supplemental investment in disability services across SUNY, CUNY, independent colleges, and proprietary colleges. Will you support this effort?
In fact, I was at the rally with Assemblymember Harvey Epstein, who's also on the task force for people with disabilities. Again, you know what? $15 million is a drop in the bucket when you consider a $400 million tax subsidy for moving making in the state of New York. So again, our budget priorities are screwed up.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember. My master's degree thanks you. Okay. And I suppose one final question on the topic of education. Of course, education, it covers K through 12, it covers higher ed, but it also covers continuing education. So what will you do to ensure that continuing education be accessible and available to adults with disabilities?
This is the first time since I've been in office, and I took office in 2013, that anyone has ever asked me about continuing education. So I really don't have an answer for you on that. I don't know what funding there is for continuing education. And I will certainly ask my legislative director to look at that issue.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember. And that wraps up our education section. And now we are going to move our attention to a very timely subject, which is the subject of voting. Americans with disabilities face many obstacles and barriers to voting, including inaccessible polling places and voting equipment, difficulty getting to polling places, and poorly informed election officials and poll workers. What will you do to ensure that people with disabilities have equal access to the fundamental right to vote?
So the ballot marking device was a significant innovation in this area. Cliff Perez, who's a very well-known advocate for persons with disabilities, was discussing with us when we have absentee ballots how that the ballot marking device is not available for absentee ballots, and he was interested in having that done. Our law firm's website is accessible to people with disabilities because my partner, Carlo de Oliveira, said that it would be an ADA violation if we didn't make it accessible, so he arranged for it to be done. I think that that could be done as well for people who, for voting for persons with disabilities. I think I was very surprised to learn, because Cliff had not called this to my attention, and I think your group did, that there is a program that you outlined at the beginning of this session to make that possible now during this violation, or during this COVID period where we don't have typical voting. I do want to say that we introduced legislation where New York would have a vote by mail system, similar to what Oregon has, where everybody who's eligible to vote would be sent ballots. That's essentially what we are doing now. I don't see any problem with doing that. And one of the other things, I've never really discussed this, and you might want to educate me on the topic, but when you do an absentee ballot, it's your choice. There's no prohibition on a person with a disability seeking the assistance of a trusted friend to take their directions and fill out the ballot, right? So that's not a violation of the secret ballot if it's done with the consent of the person filling out the ballot. And then you just have to sign the ballot and mail it back in. So there are a lot of ways to do this. I think the vote by mail system with proper security, and perhaps persons with disabilities, upon proof of appropriate qualification, could register for an online voting system, because there are obviously security issues involved with that. But I was encouraged by what you said at the beginning of the program, that there's a system now which is sort of a mix online and mail system. And plus, you can always go to one of the locations if you want to use the ballot marking device. So I think a lot of progress has been made.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember. And so, continuing on this theme, do you support providing or increasing funding for new accessible voting systems to replace the first generation accessible voting systems that have outlived their usefulness?
Well, I kind of think the vote by mail is the smartest way to go. It's the least expensive. And then we would have to have, I think, for qualified people to vote online, because that mail system did not meet their needs. I think that would have to be funded, and I'm sure something could be generated that could do that. I'm not on the elections committee, and one of the things that was done this year, I think effectively, was early voting, where you go to your polling place and they actually print ballots on demand. So that was a step with some new technology. It's not really related to persons with disabilities. I do believe that that the early voting sites are limited, but I would suspect they would have ballot marking devices. But I'm not familiar with any of the new technology other than what could be done for internet voting.
Thank you very much. And so, to wrap up our section on voting, can you tell us about some of the work you do as the chair of the Task Force on Disabilities, and how the disability community can be active participants in its work and assist with policy development?
So this is really very easy. We meet with advocates and individuals with disabilities all the time. We can do that now through Zoom, obviously, even though we're not meeting people in the office. That's one of the great things about being a legislator. And I tell this to people all the time. Anybody can make an appointment to see me, whether it's an organization or an individual. If I'm out in the community and you see me and you want to talk about state issues, I'm happy to do it, no matter what I'm doing. And that's part of being in this job, and that's what we do. I think one of the real weaknesses of our government system in New York is the governor's been given, way too much power. You have no influence over the governor. Honestly, you can't get a meeting with the governor. Your organization can't get a meeting with the governor. They might be able to get a meeting with some staff member who has no power to make decisions. When you meet with me, I have the power to say right then and there, okay, I'm going to co-sponsor this bill, I'm going to vote for this bill, or I'm not going to vote for a bill. And what I tell people about our office is that we try to be very upfront with folks. When we say we support a bill, that means we really support it. we don't want to tell people what they want to hear politically, like the member I was using as an example, who was telling the advocates for vaping that this member supported them when in fact nothing was happening of the sort. We don't do that in our office. We never would do that. My advice to everyone is just come on in, meet with us. We can bring in Kim Hill. Kim lives in the town of Colony. She is a person with a physical disability. She is the task force on, she is the director of the task force on people with disabilities. That means she is the staff member for our organization, our task force, our organization in the Assembly. Kim has been at this for a long time. She knows almost all the advocacy groups in the state, almost all the laws that have been proposed, the pros, the cons, the positives, the negatives, whether we can get them passed. Every year, we do a budget letter to the speaker and tell the speaker what we need for people in the disabilities community. And when you come and you talk to me, that sometimes the issues that are raised by the advocates that come to talk to me are in that budget letter, because we thought, hey, that's a really good suggestion. So the best thing to do is don't email your member, don't send a letter. The best thing to do is to come in person. And if you can't come in person, call Meg Brown, who's runs my office, and Meg will set up a Zoom meeting or whatever type of meeting that you want to have.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member. I'm sure we'll take you up on that.
And that's what it's all about. That's what we do all the time.
And so we have a question from the caucus.
Sure.
So, Katie?
Hey, Assemblyman, this is Katie.
Yes.
I'm glad my dishwasher just quieted down for a minute so I could ask this question.
Good thing my dog has been quiet.
So my question actually refers back to continuing education and access.
That I didn't really know about, but okay, go ahead.
Well, no, the reason I'm asking is because maybe we don't talk about it enough. I think, and you might appreciate this as a fellow attorney, access to continuing education through testing. So I care very deeply about access to testing. Before I took the New York State Bar, I wasn't sure whether I'd have to bring a discrimination lawsuit to get the accommodations I needed until they were granted in 2013. So I care deeply about accommodations, and I believe an area in which we could address access to continuing ed is through the state contracting process for exams. In particular, the GED, or now TASC exam. I think among the disability community, we've come to appreciate that sometimes the right accessibility hasn't been fully negotiated when the state purchases these products. So I'm wondering if you would support legislation or regulation to change the state contracting process to ensure that when the state makes these purchases, that they fully contemplate accessibility, like website accessibility or, WCAG compliance, things like that.
So I can do you one better on that. You were quite persuasive in what you said. So I'm going to ask you to call my legislative director, and because you are an attorney, you can work with Allison on drafting a bill of that kind. So one of the things that, when you're dealing with education, you know that the New York State education department is actually independent of the rest of the state apparatus, including the governor, and for very good reason. And most of those contracts that you're talking about are done through state ed. But I think your point is very well taken, that we could have a statewide standard for all contracts that would allow for people with disabilities to participate in a way that enables them to be successful. So, but it is a drafting question. I also know what you're trying to do is tie this to procurement. We did another bill that we were trying to do something that was tied to procurement, and the assembly staff, the higher staff, the speaker staff, told us we don't tie things to procurement, but Allison did some excellent work, and there's many, many things that have been tied to procurement. And I think this is a legitimate, I think every contract should have provisions for allowing access by persons with disabilities to whatever services or tests are being provided. So if you want to talk to Allison, I'm sure the two of you could work together on that.
Thank you very much.
518-455-5931, or you can contact us through the Assembly website. Although I have to tell you that email gets reviewed by staff, and sometimes they miss it. But I made a commitment to try and do some legislation in this area. So if you want to email me personally, I'll give you my personal email, and then I can direct it to Allison. It's probably better if you spoke to her directly and leave out the middleman. But if you feel you want to send it to me, it's steckp@icloud.com. Hey, my chief of staff just walked in. And he can watch the last several minutes of this.
Your chief of staff is adorable.
You know that?
Are there any other questions from the caucus?
Go to sleep. Yeah, I got one.
Yeah.
The Empire State Plaza, the crown jewel of state properties, when it was built in the late 60s and early 70s, it was the most accessible thing people could imagine. And it was ahead of its time because there were no laws mandating such a thing. Then came 9/11 and all the security measures that were put into place. And now the state of New York is in violation of its own laws and regulations and the ADA, where every accessible feature built into the plaza is now closed and shut down and locked. And that's disgraceful. Is there a plan to overhaul the plaza?
So that is that's an executive function. That's the governor's office. We don't really monitor the governor's compliance with ADA. I do think that would have to be done through the Division of Human Rights or through litigation. But the Assembly, we really don't enforce laws against the executive branch in that sense. So if the governor's violating a law, we don't pass a law saying don't violate the law. I think it's a question of enforcement. I don't know if the Attorney General, yeah, the dog is acting up now, but I don't, maybe that's a complaint that should be made to the New York State Attorney General. That's a law enforcement agency.
Yep.
We're not a law enforcement agency.
access is a civil right, and this is supposed to be the people's house.
Yes, it is, but we're not a law enforcement agency. We have passed laws that guarantee access, but we do not enforce our own laws. That has to be done through the AG or the Division of Human Rights or private counsel.
Okay. Anything else? Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. This was a great first time. We
Yeah,
have some more of these coming up. Now, if anybody is thinking about joining the Democratic Committee, it's not difficult to do. We could always use more people on the committee to give this caucus some real strength and real teeth to make some real good systemic change in our local and statewide communities. So every member of the committee serves a 2-year term, which just started. So you'd have to wait another 2 years if you want to run for the committee. In the meantime, if there are any vacancies on the committee, you can call your board leader or town leader and ask to be appointed to serve on the committee for the next 2 years for the rest of this term. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Phil Steck.
yes, and I want to thank you for having me, and certainly a very informative discussion. And we have one piece of possible legislation that came out of the discussion.
Okay, and we should also push to amend the Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights law, rather, so that it is in compliance with the ADA and not leaving anybody out when something just isn't quite right. Okay, so we have 3 more of these scheduled so far, and possibly a few more coming. The next one will be on Monday when uh, uh, Sam Fine is running for state assembly in the district that includes Cohoes and Watervliet and downtown Albany. We will have him on Monday, same bat time, same bat channel. Then on Tuesday, Pat Fahey will be with us. And then on Wednesday, John McDonald, who is the current member of the assembly from that district that includes Cohoes and Watervliet and downtown Albany. We'll hear what he has to say. So we'll do it again, and we'll see you then. Thank you all.
Bye.
All right.
Thank you.